Hello, my dear friends. What if the church once banned pleasure on Sundays, punished desire with iron masks, and measured purity with a burnt brick? That wasn't fiction, that was Europe. For centuries, behind stone walls and candlelit beds, the rules of sex weren't just strange. They were sacred, dangerous, and sometimes terrifying. You thought history was dry? Not this time. These are the real laws, beliefs, and rituals they dared not teach in school. Tonight, we step quietly into that forgotten world, one rule at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you think relationships are complicated today, imagine living in a time where even being intimate with your spouse came with official rules. Not rules made by your partner, not even by the king, but by the church. A group of men in robes who decided which days were too holy for anyone to touch each other, even if they were married, in love, and alone in their bed. In medieval Europe, a married couple couldn't simply be together whenever they wanted. There were rules, and not just a few, a lot. Sundays were forbidden. So was Lent, Advent, too, big feast days. Also, no, even the day before a holy day was off limits. Add them all up, and there were years where more than 250 days were banned for sex. That left barely 100 days when it was technically allowed. If they'd had smartphones back then, couples would have needed a church-approved calendar app just to know when they were allowed to cuddle. These rules weren't just ideas passed around by overly serious priests. They were enforced. There were punishments for breaking them, public confessions, fines, shame in front of the community. Some couples were told they had to fast as a form of punishment. Others were denied communion for weeks. The message was clear: even if you were married, the church still had the final say, and people listened, not because they agreed necessarily, but because saying no to the church in those days wasn't a good idea. You didn't want to be the one getting called out in the middle of Mass, or worse, having your neighbor report you for breaking one of the Forbidden Day rules. It was a bit like having a nosy neighbor who also happened to be best friends with God. The church didn't just say when you couldn't, it also told you why. The reasoning wasn't always easy to follow, but it went something like this. Holy days were meant for prayer, not pleasure. Sex was allowed in marriage, yes, but it was still seen as something messy, distracting, something that needed to be controlled, and during the holy times, the soul needed to be clean, so the body had to stay quiet. This meant couples had to keep track of days very carefully. A wedding night that happened to fall just before Lent? Too bad, they had to wait. There are actual records of couples who were married for weeks before they were allowed to sleep together. Not because they didn't want to, just because the calendar said no. It wasn't about romance, it was about scheduling, like booking a table at a busy restaurant that only opens once a month. Some people tried to get around it in villages far from big churches or bishops. People bent the rules a bit, quietly, a closed window, a door that didn't creak, a small prayer whispered afterward just in case. But in towns where priests paid attention, it wasn't so easy. Some couples even went to confession, not because they were guilty, but just to double-check the calendar. "Father, is this week okay?" Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was a long explanation, with a list of saints' days no one had ever heard of. Even royalty wasn't immune. Kings and queens were expected to follow the same restrictions. There were rumors about royal babies being born at suspicious times. People did the math, midwives remembered dates, and if it looked like something happened during a forbidden season, it became gossip, quiet gossip, of course, but everyone knew. For regular people, this constant monitoring changed how they lived. Marriages became less about closeness and more about caution. Couples learned to plan around feast days. Some kept little markers in their homes just to remind them when not to try anything. A wooden token hanging near the bed, a small chalk mark on the door frame, just enough to avoid trouble. The church meant well, at least by its standards. It wasn't trying to break marriages apart. It thought it was protecting souls, keeping the sacred sacred. But the result was that people grew afraid of something that should have felt normal. Some started to believe that even thinking about sex during Lent could bring punishment, that a child conceived on a holy day might be born with bad luck. These weren't official teachings, but they spread. One neighbor told another, and slowly the fear grew. There's also the issue of guilt. A lot of people felt it even when they hadn't done anything wrong. Just wanting to be close to their spouse became something to confess, something to apologize for. People started to see themselves as sinful just for having normal feelings. That kind of mindset doesn't go away quickly. It settles in, stays quiet, and lingers. Still, people tried to make it work. Some followed the rules exactly. Others broke them quietly, hoped for forgiveness later. Either way, the church stayed in the background, watching, not always with eyes, but with reminders, sermons, confessions, calendar notes carved in stone. Even the air in the church seemed to whisper, "Not today." If someone in the 21st century had to live under those rules, they'd probably break up just trying to figure out which days were okay. "Sorry, babe, today's the feast of Saint something. Try again next Tuesday." The strange part is no one pushed back, not out loud, not where anyone could hear. People accepted it. Maybe they didn't love it, but they lived with it, like bad weather. You wrapped yourself in a coat and waited it out, and if you were lucky, the next season came with fewer restrictions and maybe a few extra nights where no one was watching. And that's how it went, year after year, calendar page after calendar page. Love filtered through feast days, passion checked against the phases of the moon, and the sound of church bells always reminding you when to stop. Next, we'll see what happened when couples were finally allowed to be together, but only in one specific way. Because yes, even the position was regulated, and no, they weren't kidding. If you thought the church only cared about when married couples could be together, wait until you hear about how it tried to control the how. Because yes, once a couple finally made it to a day that wasn't Sunday, a fast, a feast, or a holy vigil, there was still one more thing to worry about: position. The church had thoughts, a lot of them, and it wasn't shy about sharing them. In theory, once you were married and had picked the right day, the details should have been your own business. But medieval clergy did not see it that way. They believed certain positions were pure, respectful, and aligned with God's plan. Others were considered unnatural, sinful, or worse, inspired by animals. Basically, if it looked like something two humans might enjoy, it was probably on the banned list. The only acceptable position, according to most church writings, was the so-called missionary position, man on top, woman underneath, both facing each other and ideally thinking about procreation, not pleasure. This was not just tradition, it was written in sermons, theological treatises, and confessional guides. Anything outside of that was labeled as deviant and dangerous. Some texts even suggested that experimenting in bed could result in deformed children. The way you arranged your limbs was believed to carry moral consequences. This might sound like superstition, but it was taken seriously. The fear was not only about sin, it was also about outcomes. Some believed that unusual positions could bring spiritual corruption, physical illness, or birth defects. If a child was born with a limp or a mark on their skin, people did not ask about genetics. They asked how the parents had behaved in private. It was a strange kind of logic, like blaming a crooked nose on the wrong angle of affection. But here is where it gets even stranger. The church did not just tell people what was allowed, it explained in detail what was not. Priests gave sermons warning against deviant acts, sometimes with more description than anyone needed. Manuals for confessors listed forbidden behaviors, and the language could be oddly specific, not because they wanted people to imagine these things, of course, but because they wanted to stop them. In practice, this led to a lot of awkward moments. Imagine going to confession and trying to explain yourself while the priest flipped through a list like a menu. Did you do this? No. What about that one? And then being told that even that was a sin and that you should pray for forgiveness and never try it again. Some priests were more intense than others. Some genuinely believed they were saving souls from damnation by banning certain movements in the bedroom. They were not just being nosy. They thought they were protecting the moral structure of society. And in a way, that is what made it more confusing, because they talked about things they claimed should never be thought about, and they described actions they insisted no one should ever try. It is hard to stop a fire while fanning the flames. For regular people, this added another layer of stress. It was not enough to wait for the right day, you had to worry about the right way. And if you got it wrong, you might not even know. What if your intention was good, but your posture was off? What if something shifted mid-act? Was that still a sin? Some people just confessed everything just in case. There are stories of couples asking their priests for guidance, not about theology, but about technique. And yes, that was as awkward as it sounds. Some priests answered, others scolded them for asking. A few probably blushed and mumbled something about God's will and hurried off. It was not a comfortable topic for anyone, but it did not go away. The church had made it part of daily life. Even in books written by monks or theologians, long passages are warnings against certain practices. The irony is these passages often contain more vivid imagery than most medieval poems. Some of them read like warnings. Others read like someone was taking notes with a little too much enthusiasm. But the goal, they claimed, was always the same, to protect souls and keep marriage holy. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. People are people. Curiosity existed back then too, and pleasure was not something you could erase just by writing a rule against it. But fear was powerful, especially when tied to religion. Couples who explored too far might spend the next morning in church, whispering their guilt behind wooden screens, hoping the priest would not ask too many questions. Some tried to justify themselves. They were not doing it for fun. They were just trying to conceive. Others swore it only happened once, and they did not mean to. But the rules did not leave much room for error. Intentions did not matter as much as conformity. If you strayed from the standard, even in private, even in love, it was still considered wrong. It is easy now to look back and laugh. The idea of a church-approved position guide feels absurd, but for people living then, it was not a joke. It shaped their relationships, their marriages, even their sense of self. Imagine growing up believing that the wrong movement could offend God, that your own body, your desires were constantly under surveillance, not by a person, but by a divine presence who judged silently. It makes modern dating apps look downright wholesome by comparison. Swipe right, but make sure you are aligned with the catechism. Even within noble courts where people had more privacy, the rules still echoed. Servants talked, confessors reported, rumors spread, and no one wanted to be accused of bringing spiritual danger into the household. Some noble women were told to stay silent during intimacy. Some were told not to move at all, just lie still, breathe slowly, and think about salvation. It was not about closeness, it was about control. So yes, medieval couples had sex, but not without worry, not without guilt. Even in marriage, love was monitored, laughter was rare, spontaneity was dangerous, and in place of joy, there was often just silence, shamed, and a long list of do's and don'ts. Next, we will move from the bedroom to something even stranger, a so-called virginity test involving a walk across hot bricks, because in the Middle Ages, proving innocent sometimes meant walking barefoot through fire. Literally, after worrying about the calendar and being told exactly how to lie in bed, a medieval bride still had one more thing to prove, her purity. And for some women, that proof came not from words or reputation, but from fire. In a few corners of medieval Europe, people believed that the best way to test a woman's virginity was to make her walk barefoot across bricks that had just been pulled from a fire. The idea was simple, at least in theory. A pure woman would not burn. The fire would spare her. They said it was not meant as punishment. It was seen as divine justice. If her feet blistered, the blame was on her. But if she passed without injury or with only a little redness, then she was declared untouched, holy, and worthy of marriage. Somehow, third-degree burns became the village equivalent of a character reference. This kind of ordeal was treated like a public event. Families gathered, neighbors watched. The bride, often silent and tense, would be led to the bricks in full view of the community. The heat rose in waves. The stones glowed orange. She would be asked to pray or remain calm or just keep walking. A few steps, no more, but those steps were heavy. With each one, she could feel her future rising with the smoke. The test did not stop once she finished. Afterward, her feet would be wrapped and she would be told to rest. 3 days later, someone would unwrap the bandages to check for infection. If her feet healed well, it was said to be a sign of divine favor. But if they festered, or if the wounds were deep, then rumors began. The woman would be marked by more than just burns. She would be seen as dishonest, tainted. Healing slowly was no longer a medical issue. It was a sign from God, and one that came with consequences. Most of these trials took place in small villages where people trusted old customs more than written laws. The priests might look the other way, elders might say this was how things had always been done, and families eager to protect their name often went along with it. Sometimes the test was suggested quietly, other times it was demanded openly. Refusing could raise suspicion. Agreeing was seen as brave, or at least necessary. The damage was real. The burns were serious. Some women limped for days. Others suffered infections. And still, people called it fair. They said it was God's judgment, that the fire knew the truth. It did not matter how much it hurt. What mattered was whether you passed to prepare. Some women tried tricks, soaking their feet in cold water, covering them in herbal paste, asking for cooler bricks. A few may have tried to walk quickly, hoping the speed would help, but most had no such luxury. The crowd watched every move. A stumble could be seen as fear. A flinch could be proof of guilt. There was no room for hesitation. The belief behind it ran deep. People thought virginity was not just physical, it was spiritual, and the fire, they said, could tell. It would not hurt an innocent girl. It would only punish the ones who had done wrong. Of course, they had no understanding of heat damage, skin sensitivity, or even basic science. But tradition gave them confidence. Once a story is told enough times, it starts to sound like the truth. What made it worse was that the judgment did not end when the bricks cooled. A failed test could break an engagement. It could shame a family. It could follow a woman for the rest of her life. Even if her burns were small, even if she limped only a little, people would remember. They would whisper. They would look at her differently in the market, in the church, and on the street. Some women passed the test, but still carried the fear. The pain stayed in their memory, not just the physical pain, but the feeling of being watched, judged, treated like an object to be proven instead of a person to be known. In some cases, they never spoke of it again. In others, they passed this story down quietly as a warning. This ordeal was not common everywhere, but where it existed, it was taken seriously. A few legal texts mention it, some local customs include it, and the oral stories told from mother to daughter are clear enough. The fire test was real and it was cruel. At its core, it was not really about proof. It was about control, about making sure women stayed within lines drawn by others. The test gave families a sense of order. It gave communities a reason to trust or to shame. And it gave young women one more reason to be afraid of growing up. There is no fairness in a system where skin becomes a verdict, where burns speak louder than words. But in those villages, that was the world, a world where pain became evidence and silence was seen as strength. Today we might cringe at the idea of such a test, but for them it was as real as the bricks beneath their feet. Now that we have seen how fire was used to test purity, we move to something even more unsettling. In some places, couples struggling to conceive were sent to the one place no one expected, a graveyard, because the belief was that life could begin in the presence of the dead. Following trials by fire and the pressure to walk across burning bricks, medieval couples facing infertility sometimes found themselves led to places even colder, darker, and far more unsettling. In some rural areas, when a man and woman could not conceive after marriage, they were told to seek help, not from a doctor, not from a priest, but from the dead. The belief went like this: life was a gift from God, but sometimes it needed a spark. And for reasons no one could clearly explain, that spark was believed to come from being close to death. So in a few remote corners of Europe, couples were encouraged or quietly pushed to visit a graveyard after dark, not to pray, not to mourn, but to be physically intimate right there among the tombstones. Some versions of the practice involved doing so on a particular grave, usually the burial site of a saint, a martyr, or someone considered especially holy. The thought was that the power of their sacrifice, the lingering presence of their purity, would pass into the couple and finally bring them a child. Other times, there were no specific instructions, just a general belief that something about the graveyard itself could stir fertility. It was a strange mix of faith, fear, and desperation, with a cold stone slab as the setting. No one called it romantic. These moments were quiet, awkward, and often full of shame. Some couples did it reluctantly, guided by local elders who insisted this was the way. Others did it in secret, under pressure from families, or after years of unanswered prayers. It was not about desire. It was about hope. The kind of hope that came after too many months of silence and too many side glances from neighbors asking why there was still no child. These rituals were never officially accepted by the church. They were condemned. Priests who heard of such things spoke harshly about them in sermons. Church texts warned that the dead were not to be disturbed, that holy ground should not be defiled. But in distant farming villages, where superstition often held more sway than theology, the warnings were ignored. People wanted results, not doctrine. There were stories passed around from village to village. A couple who had tried for 5 years and finally conceived after a single night by the tomb of a local saint, a woman who wept for months, then returned from the cemetery with a smile and a swelling belly. These tales spread fast, helped along by midwives and market chatter. For every priest who condemned the act, 3 grandmothers said it had worked. Of course, not every couple who tried conceived, and when they did not, the blame shifted quickly. Maybe the grave wasn't holy enough. Maybe they had not followed the ritual properly. Maybe God was angry, or worse. Maybe the woman was cursed. Infertility was never treated gently. It carried weight. It followed people. And this kind of ritual, as uncomfortable as it was, gave people something to try, something to hold on to. Many of these acts took place in silence, at night, hidden behind low stone walls or tall grass. There were no witnesses, only the moon, the trees, and the cold ground, and yet the presence of death was always close. The idea that life could begin in such a place where bodies lay still and forgotten was both eerie and deeply sad. It said something about how far people would go when they felt helpless. There were different rules in different regions. Some said the act had to be done at midnight. Others said it must be done in complete silence. A few insisted that prayers be spoken afterward, asking for forgiveness, not from God necessarily, but from the spirit of the person buried beneath them, as though the couple had borrowed something they should not have touched. Some women resisted, others cried. A few agreed only to please their husbands or families, and when it failed, as it often did, the guilt landed hardest on the woman. The logic never made sense, but it was always there. If the miracle didn't happen, someone had to be at fault, and in most stories, that someone was her. There was a cruel irony in it all. The woman who wanted life the most was the one asked to seek it in the middle of death. The church never officially acknowledged these rituals and its rules, but they appeared in confessions and warnings. Bishops wrote letters about them. Some priests traveled to villages just to speak against them, but they could not stop what they could not see, and the graveyards were quiet. The people who took part rarely spoke afterward. They wrapped their memories up and carried them silently for years. From today's point of view, it is hard to imagine such a thing. The cold ground, the grief, the quiet pressure. But back then, when options were few, people turned to whatever hope they could find, whether it made sense or not, whether it worked or not. And often they did it because someone else said they should. So among the stones and the shadows, life and death met in the most unlikely way. A desperate ritual, a lonely act, a moment between 2 people trying to create something while surrounded by reminders of what had already ended. Next, we will move from cemeteries to another public place, one where shame was used not for healing, but for punishment. Because in some towns, being unfaithful did not just mean losing trust, it meant being paraded with horns or forced to wear masks of iron. After stepping through fire and walking among graves, medieval couples still faced another kind of danger. This time, it came not from superstition, but from the public square. Because when trust was broken in marriage, especially by the woman, punishment didn't stay behind closed doors. It was brought out into the streets with iron, horns, and shame as the tools of justice. Adultery in the Middle Ages was treated as more than just betrayal. It was seen as an offense to society, to the church, and sometimes even to the stability of the village. And while both men and women could be accused, the punishments were far harsher for women, especially those without a wealth or status to shield them. One of the cruelest punishments was the use of the iron mask. It was made of metal, often rusted and poorly fitted. The mask covered the entire face and was designed to cause pain, not just embarrassment. Some had sharp spikes on the inside that pressed into the skin. Others had long pointed noses or tongues shaped like animals, mocking the idea of deceit or lust. These masks were not only heavy but also hard to breathe in. A woman forced to wear one would struggle to speak or even hold her head upright. It was punishment designed to be seen and remembered even after the mask came off. The accused might be led through the market wearing the mask as people watched. Some were chained to wooden posts, others were paraded on carts. Children laughed, adults whispered, everyone looked, and the goal was simple: shame her so thoroughly that no one else would ever follow her example. In some towns, the punishment targeted the husband too, not always with pain, but with humiliation. A man whose wife had cheated might be made to wear a pair of wooden horns on his head and walk through the village. The horns were a symbol, a public signal that he had been made a fool, that he had failed to keep his wife. Some communities believed this encouraged better behavior. Others just saw it as cruel entertainment. There were even plays and songs written about it, folk tunes mocking the horned husband. Street actors performed scenes where the crowd laughed and pointed. It became part of the culture, a reminder built into the daily life of towns and markets. And though it sounds ridiculous now, back then it was deadly serious. Reputation mattered, honor was currency, and a public walk with horns could ruin a man's standing for years. Not all punishments were physical. Some involved forced confessions in church. A woman might be made to kneel and admit her guilt aloud while the congregation stared. Others were told to fast or sleep outside or wear different clothing for months. In one region, an adulterous woman was forced to wear a red scarf every day for a year. Not because it served a purpose, but because everyone would know why. But the devices, like the iron mask, stood out most. They turned the body into a warning sign, a walking message, and often they left real injuries: broken teeth, scars on the cheeks, bruises on the scalp. The pain didn't end when the mask was removed. It stayed with the person long after the crime had been confessed. There were double standards, too. A man caught in adultery might face a fine. He might be scolded, but he was rarely masked or marched through the streets. The church preached against all forms of adultery, but in practice it was women who bore the weight, especially those who were poor, young, or without family support. It was less about fairness and more about keeping the social order in place, and women paid the price. Some of the punishments were set up as public shows: a wooden stage in the town center, a crowd gathered in the afternoon. The guilty were brought out by guards or village elders, a chair in the middle, a speech by a priest, and then the punishment: quick, dramatic, and unforgettable. These events were meant to scare others, to make people think twice. But for the person being punished, it was more than fear. It was humiliation layered over pain. There were places where the punishment went even further: whipping, cutting hair, tattooing the word adulterous onto the skin. Each act was meant to be permanent, or at least long-lasting, to make sure no one forgot what had happened, to leave a mark that could not be washed away. And yet, in some quiet corners, people still broke the rules. Affairs happened. Love did not always follow the church's calendar or the town's code, and when someone got caught, the entire weight of the community came down on them, not always for justice, often just for spectacle. Looking back, the mix of pain and performance feels almost theatrical, like justice turned into a stage play with real people suffering for the sake of a lesson. People talked about these punishments for years afterward. Children grew up hearing the stories. Some laughed, some stayed quiet, but everyone remembered. That was the goal, not just to punish, but to imprint the memory into the minds of everyone watching. And so the town square with its stalls and music and fresh bread also became a place of punishment, a place where mistakes were turned into theater, and where the line between justice and cruelty often disappeared. Next, we leave the market and return home, not to peace, but to a bedroom where even the bedsheets had something to prove. Because in many households, the morning after a wedding was not private at all. It came with a piece of cloth, and all eyes were waiting to see if it held the right stain. Marriage in the Middle Ages came with expectations, not just about land, dowries, or alliances, but about something far more personal: a piece of cloth hung outside the home, shown to family, neighbors, and sometimes the entire village. It was not decoration, it was proof, a blood-stained sheet that confirmed the bride had arrived at the altar untouched. This was not a quiet tradition, it was loud in its way. The morning after the wedding, the bedsheet was inspected, usually by a female relative or servant. If there was blood, it was good news. The sheet was taken, folded carefully, and then either displayed in public or carried to the family as a sign of honor. In some villages, it was hung from a window. In others, it was laid across the front door or the garden fence. Wherever it went, people saw it and they talked. The absence of blood, however, brought problems, serious ones. A bride who failed to provide this so-called evidence could find herself in trouble. The groom's family might demand answers. The marriage could be annulled. In some cases, the bride was sent back to her parents in shame. Not quietly, not gently, just packed up and returned like a garment that didn't fit. This practice wasn't the law everywhere, but in the places where it existed, it was followed with harsh consistency. People believed that virginity left a mark, a physical one, and if the sheet did not carry that mark, then something was wrong. Maybe the girl had lied, maybe she'd been with someone before, or maybe she was cursed. The explanations got creative, but the outcome stayed the same. The sheet was treated like a verdict, even when it had no business being one. Of course, biology doesn't always cooperate. Not every first experience causes bleeding. Not every woman leaves a visible trace. But in medieval minds, these details didn't matter. Belief outweighed fact, and that meant some women took desperate steps to protect themselves. There are old stories of brides who smeared drops of animal blood on the sheet before dawn. Some pricked their fingers and dabbed just enough to pass. Others bribed a servant to say what needed to be said. These were quiet acts of survival, small decisions made in a corner of the room under the pressure of a family's expectations and a culture that cared more about appearance than truth. In households with more status, the process could be even more formal. Witnesses were involved, not during the act, but immediately after. A trusted woman might be called in to inspect the sheet and confirm the result. Her word carried weight. If she said the blood was there, it was believed. If she said it wasn't, things got complicated. The entire future of the marriage could shift based on her opinion. There were songs and jokes about it too, whispered from mother to daughter, passed between kitchen doors. Young girls learned early what the sheet meant. Some feared it. Others rolled their eyes, but no one ignored it. It was part of the ritual, just like the feast or the wedding dress, except it was private and painful and heavy with expectation. In some cases, the groom himself did not care, but his family did. His mother, his aunt, his older sister, they would ask. They would demand to see, and if they were not satisfied, they would act. The pressure did not just fall on the bride, it fell on her reputation, her future, and her safety. There were exceptions, of course. Some couples skipped the tradition entirely. Others found ways to delay it, but those were rare. Most went through with it, whether they believed in it or not, because saying no was risky, and staying silent invited questions. It is strange to think how much rested on a piece of cloth, something soft, wrinkled, and likely stained with more than just blood, and yet, to them, it carried more weight than a wedding ring. The public nature of it all made it worse. Neighbors walking by could see the sheet. Children pointed, old men nodded. Some households treated it like a flag of victory. Others, with no sheet to show, kept their shutters closed for days. The silence said enough for the women. The memory lingered, not the act itself, but the fear, the pressure, the thought that one wrong move, one invisible mistake could undo everything. And for many, it wasn't just the first night. It was the rest of the marriage, always wondering if someone still doubted, still whispered, still remembered. The church did not formally require the bloodshed, but it rarely spoke against it. Priests may have looked the other way. Some even encouraged it, believing it helped preserve morality. In a society obsessed with honor and lineage, proof mattered, even when it wasn't real. And so the morning after became a test, not just of intimacy, but of performance, of survival. A quiet act turned into a public judgment, wrapped in linen and stained with fear. Next, we look at another belief tied to fear, this time about the male body. Some medieval thinkers were convinced that too much time in bed could shrink the brain, because according to them, pleasure wasn't just sinful, it was dangerous for your mind. After the bloodied sheets and the public shame, it might come as a relief to move into the world of medicine. But in the Middle Ages, medical advice came with its share of odd ideas, especially when it came to sex. While the church focused on morality, medieval physicians worried about health, and one of their favorite topics was the danger of too much pleasure, particularly for men. There was a belief, widely accepted at the time, that male sexual fluids were not just about reproduction. They were thought to come directly from the brain, not symbolically, literally. Some medical texts describe semen as a kind of distilled brain matter, a precious fluid made by the body's finest parts, which meant that every time a man released it, he was losing part of his memory, his clarity, even his intelligence. Doctors warned men not to be careless. They said too much sex could make you weak, tired, and confused. It could cause headaches, dizziness, and even early death. Some claimed it could bend your spine or dry out your bones. Others said it caused forgetfulness, trembling, and permanent exhaustion. It was not just about sin anymore. It was about survival. Losing your mind was just one sleepless night away if you weren't careful. Books written by educated men carried these warnings. Some were written in Latin and read only by scholars. Others were copied by hand and passed around among town healers. A few reached noble courts where young men were told to pace themselves, not because of reputation, but because of their brains. One popular medical theory said that the brain produced a clear liquid. This liquid traveled down the spine and transformed into semen. So when a man spent time in bed with his wife or anyone else, he was releasing part of that liquid. A little was fine. Too much was risky. It was like bleeding the brain dry. This theory didn't come out of nowhere. Ancient Greek thinkers had written similar things centuries earlier. By the time it reached the Middle Ages, it had been mixed with Christian warnings about lust and turned into advice that sounded scientific, but was mostly guesswork. And since no one had microscopes or a proper understanding of anatomy, it stayed popular for a long time. As a result, men were told to moderate themselves, to rest, to avoid too many nights in a row. Doctors recommended cold baths, quiet walks, light food, and sleep, lots of sleep, because that was when the brain made more of the precious fluid. If modern health influences suggest smoothies and exercise, medieval ones would have suggested celery and celibacy. Married men received special warnings. They were told that marriage should not become an excuse for excess. Being with your wife too often was still considered harmful. It could drain your body, distract your focus, and make you less effective in your work, your prayer, and your thinking. A smart man, they said, kept his mind and body in balance, which meant not giving in too often, even when he had permission. Young men training for religious life were told even more strictly. Monks were warned that even thinking about intimacy could waste mental energy. Some monasteries had schedules to help reduce temptation. No rich food, no long naps, no free time, just work, prayer, and cold water. The goal was to protect the mind by calming the body. Fathers passed these warnings to sons. Teachers mentioned them in lessons, and for men who wanted to be taken seriously, especially in law or philosophy, appearing controlled was important. A man who looked too lively or too distracted might be accused of wasting his brain, not with books, but with desire. There are records of men confessing to priests that they feared they had lost their intelligence from too much time in bed. One even said he forgot his prayers for a week and blamed it on what happened with his wife. The priest told him to fast and avoid contact for a month. Whether it helped is another story. These ideas didn't just stay in books. They shaped how people behaved. Some men took long breaks between visits to their wives. Others avoided intimacy entirely during important tasks like harvest, exams, or military planning. It was believed that too much affection could cloud your thinking before a big decision. Of course, not everyone followed the advice. There were jokes about men who ignored the rules and still seemed sharp. Some scoffed at the idea. Others whispered doubts, but the fear remained, because in a world where illness was poorly understood and mental health had no name, people clung to the theories they had, and losing your mind was no small fear. It says a lot about the time when the average man thought thinking less clearly was a direct result of loving his wife too much. The advice didn't disappear overnight. Even in later centuries, echoes of it remained. Warnings against indulgence, talks of purity and strength. Some of it folded into religious teachings. Some of it is kept alive by old habits and superstition. So the idea stuck around quietly, shaping how people lived, how they loved, and how they feared. A man's brain, his pride, and his ability to think were all believed to rest on one simple thing: knowing when to say no. Next, we returned to the church, where advice came from a different kind of authority. Because when women needed guidance on their health, the person offering it wasn't always a doctor. In many cases, it was a monk, a man with no medical training and no experience, offering written advice about bodies he had never seen. After all the warnings about lost brains and wasted fluids, medieval women faced a different kind of problem. When they needed advice about their health, especially related to reproduction, they couldn't simply visit a doctor. Not because doctors didn't exist, but because in many places women were not allowed to be seen unclothed by men outside their families. And the ones allowed to give advice were not doctors anyway, they were monks. It sounds odd now, but in many regions, monks became the default writers of medical texts. They were literate, had access to libraries, and spent long hours copying and translating ancient writings. And when it came time to explain the female body, they stepped in and did the job themselves. Not based on observation, not based on experience, just based on theory, guesswork, and other people's notes. Many of these monks had never seen a naked woman in their lives. They had taken vows of celibacy. They had spent years behind walls focused on prayer and study, yet somehow they were the ones writing guides on pregnancy, menstruation, childbirth, and even how to test for virginity or fertility. It was like asking someone who had never driven a cart to write a manual on fixing a broken wheel. Some of the advice was taken from ancient Greek and Roman sources. Other parts were based on religious ideas about purity, balance, and morality, but most of it was simply wrong. Monks believed, for example, that a woman's womb could move around the body like a lost animal, that her emotions could cause physical illness, that her health was tied directly to the behavior of the moon. There were theories about how conception worked. Some said a woman needed to feel pleasure to become pregnant. Others insisted it was better if she didn't. A few believed that the shape of the baby depended on which partner was more dominant during sex. The ideas were not consistent, but they were treated as truth, and because monks were respected, their words carried weight. Books were copied and passed from monastery to monastery. Some were written in Latin and read only by scholars. Others were translated and used by midwives and village healers. A woman in pain might be treated based on advice written by a man who had never left his cloister, and if the treatment failed, she would be told to pray harder or live more modestly. One monk wrote that women who talked too much during pregnancy were more likely to give birth to noisy children. Another suggested that a barren womb could be cured by holding a warm stone against the belly while reciting psalms. These were not jokes. They were serious instructions written in expensive ink on precious parchment meant to be followed. Sometimes the advice was harmless, a tea made from herbs, a diet adjustment, a quiet room with fresh air. But other times it was dangerous, bleeding, burning, forcing substances into the body. And because the woman had no way to explain her symptoms clearly, and the monk had no way to examine her directly, the errors piled up. There were female healers too, midwives, herbalists, mothers and grandmothers who had seen real births and knew what signs to look for. But they were often pushed aside, labeled as ignorant or superstitious. The written word was seen as more trustworthy, even when it came from someone with no practical knowledge at all. It was a time when being able to write made you an expert, even if you had never seen what you were writing about. The result was confusion. Women were told their bodies worked in ways that made little sense, that they were fragile, unstable, and driven by forces they could not control. And the people explaining this to them were men who lived far away from the world of women, scribbling by candlelight in cold stone rooms. In some areas, this created fear. Women blamed themselves for miscarriages. They believed their thoughts could harm the baby, that their dreams were dangerous, that speaking up too loudly might cause infertility. The line between faith and health was blurry, and often it hurt more than it helped. There were also confessions. Women who asked monks for advice had to be careful. Describing symptoms meant using vague words. Asking the wrong question could lead to judgment. Admitting too much could be dangerous. Some kept silent and suffered. Others trusted the monk and ended up with worse problems. Despite all this, the system continued because it was the only one people had. Monks kept writing, women kept listening, and the same wrong ideas were passed from one generation to the next. It took centuries before real study and observation replaced theory. Until then, mistakes kept happening quietly, repeatedly. So behind the monastery walls, men in robes kept drawing diagrams, listing treatments, and offering advice. Not from experience, but from tradition. Their books filled shelves, their words filled homes, and their misunderstandings filled the lives of women who had nowhere else to turn. Next, we move from misinformed monks to public courtrooms, where men faced their own humiliations. Because when a marriage failed, it wasn't just the wife who had to defend her reputation. Sometimes the husband had to stand in front of a panel of priests and prove that he could still perform physically on demand. By the time couples found themselves in church court asking for an annulment, all the shame, pressure, and awkwardness that had built up through years of rules and expectations finally reached a strange and very public climax. This part of the process was meant to settle one question: could the man perform? If not, the marriage could be declared invalid, and in some corners of medieval Europe, that question wasn't answered in private. It was answered in front of witnesses. In certain cases, when a woman claimed her husband was impotent and could not consummate the marriage, the court required proof. That meant examining the man's genitals, sometimes more than once, sometimes in front of a group. The people present weren't just doctors or monks. They included priests, lawyers, clerks, and even members of the community. A medical assistant or midwife might also be brought in, usually the only woman allowed in the room to observe closely and report her findings. This wasn't medicine. It was a courtroom with an audience, and the defendant had no clothes. Records from these trials describe men being asked to disrobe and demonstrate that they could become erect. In some cases, they were allowed time in a separate room. In others, the examination was immediate. The nurse or midwife would inspect, touch if needed, and then declare whether the man had proven his case. The decision was written into official records and sometimes read out loud. None of this was done gently. The man wasn't just stripped of his clothes, he was stripped of his dignity. There were no curtains or privacy screens, no polite euphemisms. Everything was observed, noted, and judged. If he failed to prove potency, the marriage could be annulled. If he succeeded, the case might be dismissed. But either way, the memory of that moment stayed with him and with everyone else who witnessed it. These trials were built on the church's belief that a marriage wasn't truly a marriage until it had been physically consummated. Without that act, there was no sacred bond. And because the church handled marriage as both a spiritual and legal contract, it treated impotence as grounds for breaking it. That meant evidence was needed, and in medieval thinking, the body was the most direct form of truth. Of course, the situation was more complicated than it seemed. Some men might have been healthy, but too nervous to respond. Others may have had temporary issues due to illness, age, or stress. There was no understanding of mental health or performance anxiety. A man who failed to prove potency in that one moment could lose his wife, his reputation, and his status in the community. A bad day could follow him for the rest of his life. Some men tried to explain themselves. They claimed they had been cursed, that a jealous rival had hexed them, that their wife carried a kind of spiritual blockage. In rare cases, the court allowed them a waiting period, sometimes a month, during which they were expected to recover, pray, fast, and return to try again. That second chance was rarely better than the first in cases where the man insisted he was capable, but the woman denied it. The court often turned to testimony. Servants were questioned, neighbors were asked if they had heard anything. If the couple shared a bed, but nothing ever seemed to happen, people took notice. The walls were thin, the assumptions came quickly. The court's language was formal, but the process was humiliating. In one case, a midwife described how the man trembled, sweated, and then collapsed. In another, the examiner simply said he made an effort, but there was no result. These statements were copied into church records and kept for years. Anyone with access could read them. Some men never recovered from the public embarrassment. They moved to another town, they joined the clergy, they never married again. The shame wasn't only about sex. It was about manhood, about being seen as whole. And once a man had failed in front of a crowd, even a quiet one, people remembered. It wasn't only commoners who faced this. Nobles too had their potency questioned. There were rumors in royal courts, whispered concerns about whether certain kings or princes could fulfill their duties. In a world where heirs mattered more than love, the ability to perform wasn't just personal, it was political. The double standard, as always, was there. A woman could be dismissed, shamed, or punished for failing to bleed on the wedding night. A man, in turn, could be dragged into court and asked to physically prove he could fulfill his role. In both cases, bodies were not private. They were pieces of evidence exposed, measured, judged, and while the church claimed this was about truth and justice, the human cost was high. Few men spoke of it afterward, few women did either. Even if the outcome was what they wanted, The road to get there was paved with humiliation. It's hard to imagine a modern divorce being settled by a nurse, a priest, and a few lawyers, standing around watching a man fail to get aroused. But in the Middle Ages, that was just another Thursday in court. Next, we look at the women who didn't marry at all, the ones who worked under a different set of rules, yet were still labeled shamed and marked. Because in medieval towns, prostitutes weren't hidden. They were identified by law, and everyone could see who they were from across the street. Once you step past the church doors and into the streets of a medieval town, you start to see how deeply people were categorized, married or unmarried, pure or impure, inside or outside the law. And among those most visibly marked were the women who worked in prostitution. These women were not just known. They were labeled, watched, and made to wear their identity on their backs. In many towns, there were laws requiring prostitutes to wear certain clothing that made them easy to recognize. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was enforced. Some places made them wear striped garments, others demanded yellow headscarves. A few regions required a colored belt or bright gloves or shoes that matched the district where they worked. These rules were written into town codes and read aloud at public meetings. It turned women into walking signs and their clothing into a warning label. The explanation given was that it made them easier to manage. Authorities said it helped prevent the spread of disease, reduced confusion, and protected respectable women from being mistaken for prostitutes. But underneath that logic was something simpler. The town wanted control. It didn't want to ban prostitution completely. It just wanted it in a box. A visible, regulated, humiliating box. At the same time, the hypocrisy ran deep. While the church preached purity and town councils enforced laws, many of the same men who wrote those laws were customers. Wealthy merchants, landowners, and even priests were known to visit brothels quietly. Some went at night, others used hidden doors or back alleys. But they went and they didn't stop. Rules were for maintaining appearances, not behavior. The women, meanwhile, had little say in the matter. Some entered the trade by choice, many didn't. Poverty, debt, and abandonment pushed them into it. Widows, orphans, unmarried mothers. They ended up in this work not because they lacked morals, but because they lacked options. And once they were in, the clothing marked them for life. Even if they left, people remembered the stripes, the yellow scarf, the way they walked with their eyes low and their hands tucked away. In some cities, entire districts were set aside for brothels. These were not secret places. They were known, mapped, and visited. Guards stood watch. Taxes were collected. There were opening hours, rules for conduct, and even periodic inspections. It was a business thinly covered with a veil of shame. And at the center of it were the women expected to smile, serve, and wear whatever outfit the law demanded. Not all women accepted this quietly. Some tried to blend in. They wore neutral dresses, stayed indoors during the day, and pretended to be something else. Others paid bribes to avoid the dress code. A few disguised themselves as servants or landladies. But if they were caught, the consequences were harsh. Fines, public whippings, forced marches through the market with signs that said who they were and what they had done. Children learned early what the yellow scarf meant. Teenagers joked about it. Older women looked away, and men, even married ones, learned where the district was and how to reach it without being seen. The society both condemned and consumed at the same time. The law made women visible, but only so they could be ignored during the day and visited at night. Some towns allowed prostitutes to gather in groups. They formed small communities, watched out for each other, shared food, and protected newcomers. It was the only support they had. The church offered no shelter. The law saw them as problems. Their families often cut ties, so they built their version of family made from necessity. Despite the restrictions, many women stayed in the trade for years. Others tried to leave but found the label followed them. Even if they married or changed cities, someone would mention the scarf or the stripes. Some women turned to religious orders later in life. A few managed to open inns or shops, but the mark lingered. Respectability was hard to rebuild once it had been stripped away. The dress code itself varied from town to town. In London, a prostitute might be forced to wear a hood of a certain color. In Paris, a striped gown was required. In parts of Italy, yellow became the color of shame. But the message was always the same. These women were different, and the town wanted everyone to know. There are surviving records of fines issued to women who broke the dress code. names, ages, descriptions of clothing. Some entries are cold and brief. Others include odd details. One woman was fined for wearing a green cloak too fine for her station. Another was punished for removing her identifying belt while walking through a churchyard. The law was watched closely, and forgiveness was rare. It's strange to think that in a society so obsessed with morality, so many efforts went into managing the very thing they claimed to oppose. Some historians believe the clothing rules were meant to keep prostitutes away from respectable women. Others think it was about making sure clients didn't bring home diseases. But most agree it was about power, visual control, a way for towns to say, "We know who you are, and we want everyone else to know too." So, these women moved through the streets in clothing they didn't choose, carrying a label they couldn't remove, not for themselves, not for others, but for the comfort of a society that didn't want to face its contradictions. Next, we leave the striped gowns and yellow scarves behind to enter the private corners of monastic life. There, among the monks who preached restraint, some found quiet ways to deal with temptation, not with people, but with clay, with figures, with silence. In the quiet corners of medieval monasteries, far from the marketplaces and courts, life followed a different rhythm. Days were filled with chant, scripture, and silence, but not even thick stone walls could shut out the human body. Desires came quietly. They didn't knock, didn't shout, they simply stayed. And when they did, some monks found ways to deal with them that might seem unusual today. Among these quiet adaptations was something that looked harmless at first. A figure, a statue, small enough to hold, human in shape, but not quite human. Made of clay or wax, or even carved from soft wood, sometimes dressed in scraps of cloth, sometimes plain and smooth. It wasn't made for worship. It wasn't an idol. It was something else entirely, a substitute, a comfort. There are scattered records tucked into confessionals or marginal notes that mention these figures. A monk might describe crafting a small woman-shaped statue and keeping it beside his bed. He might claim it helped him sleep better, or that it reminded him of purity or of temptation overcome. The words were careful, but the meaning was often clear enough. In some cases, these objects were called companions, not in the romantic sense, but as a way to soften the idea. They weren't real people. They didn't speak or move or touch, but they offered something to hold, something to lean against during long winter nights. And for those who had sworn off all physical affection, even that was something. Some monks kept these figures hidden under blankets, in wooden chests, behind books on dusty shelves. Others placed them in the open, pretending they were simple decorations or devotional aids. But the truth had a way of seeping out. There are notes written by abbots scolding younger monks for growing too attached. There are reports of novices whispering about someone who slept with a figure. And there are letters, rarer, where a monk admits that the object brought him peace. It sounds odd today, but perhaps not much stranger than sleeping with a body pillow shaped like a cartoon character. Some of the figures were detailed with painted eyes and shaped lips. Others were just bundles of cloth with a vague silhouette. The goal wasn't realism, it was comfort, a way to soothe the part of the body that didn't always listen to prayer. A hand on cool clay, a familiar shape under wool, something that asked nothing and promised nothing. Not everyone approved. In stricter monasteries, even a carved face could be seen as dangerous. It was too easy, they said, to start imagining more, to turn the symbol into a substitute, to blur the line between restraint and indulgence. Some abbots banned such objects outright. Others quietly tolerated them, believing it was better than letting urges grow in silence until they turned into bigger sins. One might say it was the medieval version of harm reduction. The church had little official stance on these figures. They weren't mentioned in the major councils or papal letters. They didn't fit neatly into categories of sin or sacrament. Most priests preferred not to speak of them at all, but in private writings they show up again and again. A monk in France wrote of a statue that guarded his dreams. A brother in Italy claimed his clay companion helped him resist temptation for over a decade. In England, one confession described a wax figure that had been secretly repaired 5 times. There's something quietly human in these stories, the need for closeness, the way to stay within the rules while still feeling less alone. The figures weren't always kept for sexual reasons. Some monks said they reminded them of their mothers or sisters. Others claimed they represented saints, but these justifications were thin. Everyone understood the real reason. Desire doesn't vanish with a vow. It just changes shape, and sometimes that shape is molded in clay and wrapped in linen. Not all monks were comfortable with their choices. Some destroyed the figures after years of use. Others confessed and wept and asked to be reassigned. There were even cases where entire dormitories were searched after rumors of inappropriate objects spread, but despite the shame, the figures kept returning. New ones appeared, new hands shaped them. In the broader society, these stories rarely escaped the walls of the monastery. Lay people might hear rumors, but few knew the details, and even fewer dared to ask. Monks were supposed to be pure, above such things. Admitting that even they struggled made people nervous. So the silence grew thicker, and the figures stayed hidden. There's something both sad and sweet in the image of a man wrapped in robes, whispering prayers by candlelight, then turning to hold a small, silent companion as he falls asleep. These figures weren't magic. They didn't solve everything, but for some, they offered a little peace, a little sleep, a little relief from the weight of desire that never quite went away. And in a world where even thoughts could be sinful, that was no small thing. As dawn broke through the monastery windows and the bell rang for morning prayer, the figures were tucked away again, quiet, still, unmentioned, but always there, waiting, not to tempt, not to seduce, just to help someone through another day of silence and restraint. Now, from these quiet chambers, we move back into the grander world of royalty, into myths more dangerous than clay, and secrets more whispered than silent prayers, where the idea of purity took a darker, crueler form, and where young girls paid the price for a lie dressed in white. There was a belief in medieval Europe that clung to life longer than it should have. It did not spread through sermons or scrolls, but through whispers, fears, and the desperate hopes of men who thought themselves dying. The belief was this, that sleeping with a virgin could cure illness. It was never proven, never holy, and never safe. But it stayed, and it hurt people, especially the youngest and most vulnerable. In noble households where physicians failed and herbs lost their power, people turned to stories. A knight with lesions on his face, a baron whose joints ached and whose mind wandered. They were told the same thing over and over, that their bodies were poisoned, that they carried something foul inside them, and that the only cure was purity, innocence, youth, a girl who had never known a man. This idea wrapped itself in the language of cleansing. It was described as passing on the illness, as drawing it out. The virgin, they claimed, was untouched, so her body could absorb the sickness and make the man whole again. It was, to some ears, a medical theory, to others, a last resort. But to the girls involved, it was nothing short of violence. These weren't women, they were children, often poor, often without protectors, sold by their families or stolen outright, given to sick men under the guise of tradition, dressed in white, made to lie still, and afterward cast aside. It is one of the darkest things to be passed off as medicine. The disease most often linked to this superstition was syphilis. In a time before antibiotics, it devastated the body slowly. It began with sores, then traveled inward. It ate at the bones. It dimmed the eyes. It clouded the mind. Noblemen, ashamed and desperate, would listen to anyone who promised relief. And when physicians failed, there were always those who offered a quieter solution. No one kept public records of these acts, but they left traces. Hints in letters, warnings in church decrees, stories passed down in local memory. A bishop writing from Spain warned that cures of flesh cannot be found in the undoing of innocence. A midwife in Germany claimed she saw a girl no older than 8, bleeding and silent after being taken from a castle. These weren't isolated events, they were a symptom of a larger sickness. There's something tragically modern about the way wealth tries to escape consequences, even if it means destroying someone smaller. Some kingdoms tried to stop it. Edicts were issued. Clergy spoke out. The Vatican condemned the practice publicly in more than one century, but superstition doesn't yield to logic, not quickly, and not when someone rich enough is asking for silence. In some villages, girls were warned to avoid the roads near noble estates. Mothers locked doors not just against wolves, but against well-dressed visitors from the capital. In towns, gossip flowed like water. People knew something was happening, even if they didn't speak of it out loud, and the girls who returned changed, if they returned at all, were proof enough. Not all men believed the myth. Some scoffed at it. Others were simply too proud to admit they were sick. But for those who did believe, no amount of preaching could undo the lie. They weren't thinking of the girl as a person. She was a vessel, a treatment, a tool. In their eyes, pain was part of the cure. The church often spoke against sin, but when sin wore a noble crest, it whispered instead of shouted. There are even records of physicians recommending virginal contact without full intercourse, as if that made it better. Some said a kiss would suffice. Others suggested lying beside the girl without touching. But these boundaries blurred easily, and in the end, the girl was always the one left with scars. The tragedy extended beyond the act itself. Many of these girls were never believed. They were blamed for seducing, for exaggerating, for being too pretty, too silent, too present. Some were turned out of their homes, others were sent to convents. The stain once placed was hard to scrub away, and still the myth lingered through the 14th, 15th, and even into the 16th centuries. It traveled with merchants and pilgrims, slipping between fact and fear. By the time science began to speak clearly, many had already suffered. It is one thing to be sick. It is another to believe your cure lies in breaking another. There is no softness to this memory, no way to make it gentler. But there is something to be said about the women who survived, about the midwives who tried to protect, about the mothers who locked their doors, about the scribes who wrote down what others wanted forgotten. They left behind a quiet resistance, and slowly over time, that myth began to lose its hold. It didn't vanish, not completely, but it faded enough that other stories could take its place. Stories of healing that didn't involve harm, of science that didn't demand innocence. Tonight, as you lie under clean covers and listen to history stretch and groan across the centuries, remember this, that sometimes the past is not a lesson, it's a warning, and that belief, no matter how old or sacred it sounds, must always be weighed against the harm it causes. Ahead, we'll follow the strange path of magic charms and protective spells, where even bones and animal skins were thought to stop a child from forming, and where people pinned their hopes not on reason, but on string and whispered words. Under the heavy cloaks and layers of wool that filled medieval villages and towns, there was another layer not always seen, a layer of fear, of worry, of hoping to control what couldn't be fully understood. People feared illness, famine, and war, but they also feared pregnancy, especially when it came too soon or too often. And in a world without modern contraceptives, people turned to what they had: bones, leather, thread, belief. In some regions, women and men alike wore small pouches tied around their waists or necks. These pouches didn't hold coins or keepsakes. They held charms, pieces of bone from a frog, a scrap of goat hide, sometimes a dried batwing, or a string knotted 13 times under a full moon. These were not decorations, they were tools. They were thought to protect, not against arrows or curses, but against unwanted children. It sounds strange now, but to them it made sense. Fertility was not a science yet, it was a mystery. And like all mysteries, people filled the gaps with whatever they could. Some charms were passed down from grandmothers, others were made fresh each month, blessed by someone in the village who claimed to know the right words. A chant here, a breath held there, the hope that something in the spell would work where nature might betray them. In a way, these charms were like medieval insurance policies, unscientific, uncomfortable, and probably ineffective, but somehow reassuring. Most were worn discreetly. Women tucked them under shifts, men tied them inside their belts. If someone saw the corner of a carved bone peeking out, they usually looked away. No one wanted to be caught talking about it. These things were both private and public, known but not named, whispered about but rarely discussed in daylight. Some charms were made of parchment, with symbols drawn in ink made from gall and soot. They might bear the name of a saint or a symbol said to confuse the womb. Others used Latin phrases copied from books no one understood, written by men who claimed to have seen angels. A few even came with instructions: wear this only on Mondays, or tie this above the left thigh before lying with your husband. It wasn't about logic, it was about hope. The church disapproved, of course, not necessarily because of the goal, but because of the method. Magic was frowned upon. especially magic that tried to sidestep God's will. But even some clergy quietly looked the other way. After all, a poor family with 7 mouths to feed might need a little extra help. And if that help came in the shape of a frog bone wrapped in red string, well, who are they to argue? It's funny how often people who preach against superstition are the first to carry garlic when walking alone at night. In some towns, charm sellers were known by name. They didn't advertise, but word got around. A woman at the edge of the forest, a man who lived above the tannery. They didn't just sell charms, they gave advice, told people when to sleep apart, when to drink certain herbs, when to say certain words. In a world without clinics, they were the closest thing to family planning that existed. Of course, these methods didn't always work. They probably rarely did. But when a woman made it through another season without swelling at the belly, she credited the charm. It wasn't proof, it was faith. And if she did become pregnant, well, maybe she tied it wrong. Or maybe the moon was wrong. Or maybe God had willed it after all. Some charms were more elaborate, tiny pouches of animal hair, miniature wooden carvings shaped like wombs. Even mixtures of herbs and wax were molded into odd shapes and buried at the edge of a field. People believed that burying a charm near the home could protect the entire household, that the ground itself could absorb the risk. These ideas weren't taught in school. They came from neighbors, midwives, old songs, and older fears. Not all reactions were gentle. In times of famine or plague, people who sold or wore charms could be accused of witchcraft. It didn't take much. A miscarriage here, a sick child is there. Suddenly, a piece of bone wasn't protection. It was evidence. Trials were held, confessions extracted, some were banished, others didn't survive. The line between healer and heretic was as thin as the string around a woman's waist. And yet, the practice continued quietly, carefully in corners and behind curtains. Mothers gave their daughters charms as part of their dowry. Wives slipped them into husbands' pockets, not to deceive, but to feel safer, to hold on to a small sense of control in a life that offered very little of it. Even now, there's something oddly familiar about the urge to carry something small, something secret, to help us feel protected from the things we can't quite name. When historians look back at these practices, they often smile. They write about them as curiosities, as relics of an ignorant past, but they forget something, that these people weren't foolish, they were scared. And like all scared people, they reached for whatever might help. A charm wasn't just a bone or a knot, it was a prayer in disguise. Ahead, we'll explore the idea that desire itself might be a symptom of possession, and how those with high libido were sometimes locked away, exorcised, or treated like something unholy. Under the soft candlelight of a quiet chapel, not all prayers were whispered in peace. Some were recited urgently over people who trembled not from illness, but from something the church claimed to be darker. In those days, when a person showed too much desire too often or too openly, it wasn't called obsession or addiction, it was possession. Something unholy had entered them. They believed something that stirred their thoughts and body in ways that couldn't be ignored. The answer wasn't medicine, it wasn't kindness, it was an exorcism. These people weren't seen as struggling, they were seen as corrupted. Sometimes it was a young monk who couldn't focus on his prayers. Other times it was a widow who refused to live quietly, or a married man who looked too long at the wrong woman. Each case felt personal, but the treatment was the same. The church did not ask what had gone wrong in their lives, it asked what spirit had taken hold of them. In medieval logic, strong desire wasn't a symptom, it was a sign of the devil setting up camp. Rituals followed. They were not always violent, but they were rarely gentle. A person would be brought into a dark room. A priest would begin chanting prayers in Latin. A crucifix was pressed to their chest. Holy water was dabbed on their forehead. There were candles, incense, and silence, broken only by the slow voice of a man trying to speak sacred words louder than temptation. These weren't secret events. Sometimes the family watched. Sometimes the whole village knew. The person in the center often wept. They weren't resisting the priest. They were resisting themselves. They believed what they had been told, that what they felt wasn't theirs to control. It belonged to something else, something evil. And so, they submitted. Some fasted for days. Others were locked in small cells within monasteries, separated from the world and its temptations. They were ordered not to speak, not to touch, not even to look for too long. Meals were simple, beds were hard. They slept fully clothed if they slept at all. Everything was designed to drain the desire from them, like pulling water from a soaked cloth. It wasn't therapy, it was discipline dressed up as purification. For those deemed more stubborn, the process grew harsher. Hair shirts were common. These were coarse garments that scratched the skin until it bled. Some wore iron chains under their clothes to remind themselves of their sins. A few were beaten with branches in rituals that were more painful than symbolic. All of this was believed to drive out lust, to cleanse the body through suffering. Monasteries and convents weren't just places of peace. They were also places of exile. A woman accused of lust could be locked away for years. A man might be sent to a distant priory where no one knew his name. Out of sight, out of temptation. Or at least that was the hope. In truth, those walls did little to stop desire. The feelings didn't vanish. They just went quiet, hiding behind prayers and locked doors. Sometimes the very ones performing the rituals harbored the same urges. A priest could smell the perfume on a woman's sleeve and feel a stir of guilt. A nun might remember a warm touch from her past and tried to pray it away. But they didn't speak of these things. They preached control. They demanded silence. It was a time when everyone pretended they were stronger than they were, and no one wanted to be the first to admit they were human. People feared being labeled. A neighbor could accuse another out of spite. A scorned lover might claim their former partner was possessed. Rumors spread quickly. A look across the market, a laugh that lasted too long, a walk taken alone after dusk. That was all it took to draw attention. And once someone was labeled, it was hard to escape the process that followed. Women faced the worst of it. A man might be excused with an extra confession. A woman was seen as a danger. Her presence, her voice, even her hair could be called seductive. It didn't help that the church believed women were more vulnerable to possession, more likely to invite the devil with their weakness. So they were watched more closely, judged more harshly, and forgiven less often. Even among those who were freed, the experience left marks. Some never married, others were avoided in town. A few became overly devout, spending the rest of their lives in quiet penance. They lived under the shadow of who they had been accused of being long after the prayers had ended. Something is unsettling about a world where desire became a crime and silence was treated as salvation. And yet, in their way, they believed they were doing good. They believed they were protecting souls, keeping society pure, and maintaining balance between flesh and spirit. The rituals weren't done out of cruelty. They were done out of fear. Fear of temptation, fear of disorder, fear of what people might do when no one is watching. Today, it's easy to look back and shake our heads, to wonder how anyone could think desire was a doorway for demons. But in a world without science, without support, without understanding, the church filled the gap. It offered answers. Harsh, yes, but simple. And in a time of confusion, simplicity was a comfort. Soon we'll move from the chapel to the pulpit, from rituals of fear to sermons filled with warnings, not whispered, but shouted, not private, but public, and often far more graphic than expected. On quiet Sundays, when the wooden pews were filled with wool coats and silent prayers, the pulpit became more than a place for spiritual guidance. It became a stage. The priest, standing above the heads of his listeners, did more than speak of angels or mercy. He warned, he listed, he described, and sometimes those descriptions wandered into strange, uncomfortable territory, especially when the topic turned toward sins of the flesh. Church sermons in the Middle Ages weren't always gentle reminders to love thy neighbor. They were often stern warnings about what not to do, especially behind closed doors. The priests believed they had a duty to outline the dangers of lust in full detail to protect their flock from falling into temptation. But the way they went about it was at times surprisingly vivid, not because they intended to titillate, but because they genuinely thought that clarity was more effective than subtlety. In their minds, vague warnings were useless. Specific ones, even awkwardly specific, got the job done. And so people sat through sermons that named acts, described positions, and outlined consequences in ways that would have felt more at home in a scandal sheet than in a house of worship. The priest might raise his voice to ensure the back row heard him describe a forbidden behavior. He might pause for effect when listing the kinds of thoughts that led to eternal damnation. The tone was meant to be serious, but the content could border on uncomfortable. For young listeners, it was often the first time they heard of certain acts at all. Parents would shift in their seats. Some stared straight ahead, others fidgeted, unsure of where to look. The priest, however, pressed on, unwavering. He was there to instruct, not to entertain. Still, the lines blurred. The more he explained what was forbidden, the more clearly the congregation understood exactly what he was talking about. It was, in a way, an education. Not a healthy or open one, but an education all the same. The irony was not lost on some. While the church worked tirelessly to suppress sinful behavior, it may have accidentally introduced it to minds that hadn't thought of it before. A teenager who had never imagined certain things left church with a list of new images to wrestle with. A married couple might have shared a confused glance after hearing what not to do, and the community in general carried those words out of the chapel and into whispers by the well, into jokes told too loudly at the tavern. These sermons were not random. They followed a schedule. Lent, Advent, and certain feast days were popular times for moral instruction. Priests were given handbooks filled with pre-written sermon outlines. Many of those outlines went far beyond simple morality. They described in great detail what kinds of touching were allowed and which weren't, what positions were acceptable and which were punishable by God. The level of detail was meant to guide, but sometimes it wandered into curiosity. There were moments when a sermon felt more like a checklist. Don't do this, don't do that, avoid this behavior, repent if you've done that one. And the people listened, wide-eyed or red-faced, trying to figure out if the priest was talking about them. Some took notes in the back of their minds, not because they wanted to sin, but because now they had a fuller picture of what sin looked like. One might say the church accidentally gave out more sexual knowledge than it intended, wrapped in the packaging of fear. This wasn't just in one village or town. Across Europe, priests followed similar patterns. Some were more theatrical than others. A few used props like holding up a belt to represent temptation or pointing to a flame to symbolize hell. Others simply leaned into their voice, letting silence hang after particularly graphic warnings. They believed they were saving souls. The more graphic the sermon, the more people would remember it, they reasoned. But over time, some began to question whether the sermons were doing what they were supposed to. A few parishioners found themselves dwelling too long on what was said. Others grew anxious, worrying that a single stray thought or wrong move might send them straight to damnation. And then some found it all strangely fascinating, not because they wanted to sin, but because the priesthood painted such a vivid picture of it. Still, attendance never dropped. People came back each week. They wanted to be seen in church. They wanted to stay in good standing, and deep down, they wanted to hear what the priest would say next, even if it made them uncomfortable, even if it made them blush. There was power in words, and the church knew how to use them. It used them to control, to shape behavior, and to reinforce rules. But words also had a way of slipping into the imagination and staying there. It was a strange balance between shame and instruction, both fear and curiosity, and everyone played their part. From the pulpit, the priest saw the tops of heads nodding or shaking. He didn't always know what they were thinking, but he believed in his mission. He believed that the more clearly he described sin, the more likely his people would stay away from it. Whether that was true or not remained a quiet question in many minds. Now we leave the stone walls of the chapel and step outside again into the lives of those who carried those sermons home. Some would change their behavior, some would feel guilt, and some would do what people have always done. Smile politely, nod at the priest, then whisper to a neighbor about the strange new thing they just learned. The church spoke loudly, but the street spoke back. There were places hidden far from city walls and watched only by the trees where people believed that death needed more than a prayer. It needed a ritual, not the kind done with incense and hymns, but something older, something darker, a practice that didn't seek peace through silence, but through flesh. In these corners of medieval Europe, where folklore was stronger than law, there were whispers of rites that involved the body of the dead, and not just touching or chanting. It went further than that. The belief was rooted in fear, not fear of ghosts exactly, but of unrest, that a soul might cling too tightly to the world unless someone performed a final act. And for reasons that mixed confusion with desperation, some believed that union with the body could give the spirit release. It was the kind of idea that could only survive in places where the line between superstition and madness was paper thin. These stories didn't come from noble courts or church sermons. They came from oral traditions, the kind passed from grandmother to grandson when the fire was low and the night was long. Often the tale involved a person who died violently. A young woman drowned unjustly, a man was murdered without last rites, a child was buried too quickly. Their spirits, it was said, cried out for peace, and someone, usually a chosen person or a cursed one, was sent to offer the act. The ritual was not done with celebration. It was whispered about with discomfort. In many tales, the participant was reluctant, sometimes even forced. They were told it was necessary, that if they didn't follow through, the dead would haunt the village, cause crop failure, or bring sickness to newborns. The pressure didn't come from one person, it came from a whole community weighed down by dread. It says something about human fear that people would rather commit horror than risk the unknown. Of course, the church strongly condemned such acts. It labeled them profane, heretical, and deeply sinful. But condemnation is one thing, prevention is another. In isolated regions where priests visited only once a season, old beliefs filled the gaps. A blessing from a bishop carried less weight than a story a family had believed for generations. And when desperation crept in, especially in times of plague or famine, people reached for whatever they thought might work. Some versions of the story claimed the act had to be performed at midnight. Others said the corpse had to be freshly buried and then dug up under a specific moon phase. In a few areas, they believed the ritual would only succeed if the person wept during the act. These details were never written down formally, but they spread anyway, each retelling adding a new piece, each listener either horrified or strangely intrigued. It's important to understand that not all people believed in this. Even in villages where the story existed, most treated it as a warning, not a truth. But the fact that it was known at all, the fact that it survived through centuries of change, shows just how strong fear can be, especially the fear of the dead, especially when grief becomes unbearable and guilt mixes with tradition. There were also stories where the ritual went wrong, where the spirit did not rest but became angrier, where the person involved felt sick or mad. In these tales, the lesson shifted from release to punishment. It wasn't just that the act was strange, it was dangerous, forbidden, a step too far. Yet the same communities kept telling those stories as if trying to warn future generations without truly letting go of the idea. It's one of those beliefs that makes you stop and wonder how far humans will go to make sense of death. In the minds of those who practiced it, it wasn't always about lust or perversion. It was about duty, a sacrifice of self for the good of the whole. That makes it no less disturbing, but it does make it more human. People don't commit strange acts because they want to. They do it because they think they have to. And when life is hard and answers are few, rituals become lifelines. Even long after such rites faded from practice, their memory clung to rural legends. Some graveyards became feared not because of ghosts, but because of what might have once happened there. Some families kept quiet about certain relatives. A distant cousin who returned from the woods was never quite the same. A child was born 9 months after a death in the village. The past was never far, especially in places where the earth was still soft with history. To modern minds, this seems impossible. It feels like fiction, too grotesque to be real. But history isn't made of what we're comfortable with. It's made of what people truly did, and more importantly, what they truly believed. And in a world where the church tower was distant, but the graves were close, people believed in strange things. They still do in some ways, just with new names. As the air turns quiet and the stories grow stranger, we move now from the graves to the bedrooms, where even royal couples weren't always left alone. What happened next wasn't about death, but it certainly wasn't private either. By now, most people have gotten used to the idea that royal weddings were grand affairs. There were flowers, feasts, dancing, and parades, but behind all the ceremony and the polished appearances, there were rituals that today would feel more than a little unsettling. One of those rituals, practiced in several royal courts across medieval Europe, involved not just the bride and groom, but an entire audience. Not during the vows, not at the altar, but during the wedding night itself in certain noble houses, especially when the union carried political importance. Consummation was not considered a private matter. It had to be observed, it had to be confirmed. The marriage was not complete until it had been physically sealed, and someone had to witness that moment. Sometimes it was a trusted courtier, other times a group of servants, and in a few rare cases senior members of the household would stand near the bed, candles in hand, waiting for the act to conclude. It was the medieval version of signing a contract, only sweatier and with significantly fewer clothes. These witnesses were not always in the same room, but they were close. Curtains might separate them from the bed, or they might be positioned at the doorway, peering in just long enough to nod and report back to the household. In the most extreme examples, the bride's mother or a royal advisor would inspect the linens afterward, checking for signs that the marriage had been fulfilled. The sheet once again became more important than the people themselves. It is hard to say what was more uncomfortable, the act or the paperwork that followed. The justification for all this surveillance was rooted in politics and inheritance. In royal families, marriages were not about love. They were treaties with flesh and blood. If a queen failed to bear children, or if someone questioned the legitimacy of an heir, the blame could easily fall on the consummation. That was why there had to be proof, not feelings, not affection, just physical evidence that the union had begun. To add to the awkwardness, the bed itself was sometimes wheeled out into public view. There are records from French and English courts where, after the ceremony, the newlyweds were escorted to a special chamber, undressed by servants and laid into bed under the watchful gaze of the household. Cheers might erupt, a priest might give a final blessing, wine would be passed around, and then, at a signal, the curtains were drawn and the audience dismissed. What happened next was still considered sacred but not secret. These practices were not universal. In many places, the wedding night was private, quiet, and shielded from outside eyes. But in the highest echelons of power, privacy was a luxury. Kings and queens lived on a stage. Every action had meaning, every rumor had weight. If someone whispered that a marriage had not been consummated, that whisper could spiral into rebellion. So the bed became a battlefield, and intimacy became a performance. There was also the matter of the bride's status. In royal marriages, especially those involving young princesses married for alliances, the consummation was often delayed. A girl might be officially married at 12, but not expected to share a bed with her husband until a few years later. Still, the pressure to confirm the union lingered. Some kings insisted on symbolic rituals where a hand was laid between the sheets, or a kiss was witnessed in bed, just to quiet the gossip. It was less about the act and more about control. Privacy for a royal couple was not just rare, it was almost suspicious. For the servants who had to oversee all of this, the experience was awkward, but also routine. They were trained to manage the logistics. Fresh linens were prepared. Perfumed herbs were laid beneath the pillows. Candles were lit, not too bright, but not too dim. The temperature of the room was adjusted if possible. A basin of water might be placed nearby. And then, once the couple was inside, they stood back and waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for just minutes. And when the door finally opened, they resumed their duties as if nothing unusual had happened. It was perhaps the most uncomfortable job in a household already filled with uncomfortable jobs. The strange thing is, no one seemed to question it, not out loud at least. The rituals were accepted as tradition. They were seen as necessary steps to protect lineage, property, and divine favor. People believed that God watched over marriages, and so it made sense in their minds for humans to do the same. What mattered most was that everything appeared legitimate, even if it meant turning a deeply personal moment into a shared performance. Some nobles, especially in later centuries, began to object. There are letters from brides expressing their horror at being expected to perform before others, or at the idea of their first night being reviewed like a legal proceeding. But those voices were quiet, and they rarely changed the rules. The customs lingered, especially in courts obsessed with tradition and control. The irony was that while everyone was focused on confirming the marriage, no one was asking whether the couple wanted to be married in the first place. Today, these rituals feel absurd, invasive, cruel, but in their time, they were logical. They fit within a framework where individuals existed to serve the dynasty, where marriages were business contracts, and where personal feelings had no place. Even love, when it existed, had to wait until duty was fulfilled. So the bed became a symbol of power, of obedience, of submission. It was not just where couples rested, it was where alliances were sealed and futures decided. The fabric of the sheets mattered more than the feelings between the people beneath them. And somewhere in that flickering candlelight, with servants lingering outside and advisors waiting for news, two people were expected to begin a life together, whether they wanted to or not. As we step away from the strange chapter of history, it is worth remembering how far privacy has come. That a room with a closed door is not just a convenience, it is a luxury. And in the distant past, even kings and queens often went without it. In the medieval world, rules about intimacy did not stop at marriage vows or consent. The church extended its gaze far beyond the altar and into the bedroom, where even the timing, mood, and physical condition of a couple could fall under suspicion. It was not enough to be married. It was not enough to love or desire. According to certain teachings, one had to be physically pure and mentally composed before engaging in any act of closeness. That meant no headaches, no fatigue, no hunger, no emotional distress. Only under specific conditions was the union considered acceptable. Anything less was grounds for spiritual concern. There were writings, sermons, and confessions that made it clear. If a person was sick, weak, or distressed and still proceeded with intimacy, they could be accused of sinning. This was not seen as a private matter. It was framed as a moral failing, one that might require penance or even public shame, because nothing says holy union like a checklist of physical qualifications. The idea came from a mix of theology and medieval medical theory. The body and soul were thought to be deeply connected. When one was weakened, the other was vulnerable. Illness opened the door to sin, and strong desires during weakness were viewed with suspicion. Clergy taught that, when people gave in to desire during moments of physical exhaustion, they were being ruled by lust, not love. And if they were ruled by lust, then the devil might not be far behind. In some places, confessors asked direct questions about this. Did you lie with your spouse while ill? Were you grieving or anxious? Had you eaten that day? Had you drunk too much wine? All these were considered relevant. It was not enough that the act was between husband and wife. It also had to meet the conditions of purity. And purity, in this case, meant calmness, energy, and full clarity of mind. So much for spontaneity. The punishments varied. Sometimes it was private, a confession, a prayer, a small act of penance. But other times, especially if the couple had flaunted the rules, it could become a community affair. A man who was seen to pursue his wife when she was visibly weak might be called out in church. A woman who encouraged her husband while sick might be accused of tempting him. The language was harsh, the judgments were sharp, and the message was clear. Intimacy was sacred, but only when the body and spirit were in proper condition. Of course, the definitions of proper condition were vague. What counted as too tired? What level of hunger was still acceptable? These lines were blurry, but they were enforced nonetheless. Medieval people were often poor, often sick, and often overworked, yet they were still expected to observe these ideals. For many, it created a sense of guilt around something that should have been ordinary, even joyful. Instead, couples found themselves weighing their own bodies like they were in a courtroom. There was also a strange kind of logic behind the rules. Church leaders feared that people would use physical closeness as a distraction from suffering, that they would turn to it for comfort instead of prayer. So they set up boundaries. They made sure that even within marriage, desire came second to discipline. It was about control, about keeping people focused on heaven, not pleasure. Interestingly, there were exceptions. If the act was done to conceive a child, and if it was done with humility and in good faith, some leniency might be granted, but even then one was expected to be careful. No joking, no laughter, no affection that looked too playful. It had to be serious, focused, almost clinical. Intimacy was allowed, but only as a duty, like tending to livestock or mending a roof. This view shaped how people talked, or rather did not talk, about their private lives. Couples rarely admitted to bending the rules. If they broke them, they did so quietly. They avoided confession for a while. They lit candles at church. They hoped for forgiveness through silence. In some households, elders or confessors kept track of the couple's health, gently reminding them when to wait. In others, it became a source of tension. One partner would feel ready, the other would worry about sin. The result was not harmony, but hesitation. For those who dared to speak out, the language was cautious. Some women asked quietly if it was wrong to lie with their husband while recovering from childbirth. Some men asked if it was better to abstain when tired from fieldwork. The answers were always the same. Wait until you are strong. Wait until you are clear. Wait until you can do it without risk to your soul. Meanwhile, daily life made such conditions nearly impossible, and yet the church continued to insist. Books of confession included long lists of sins that sounded more like household schedules. Did you rise too late? Eat too little? Speak while angry? Engage in the marital act while unwell? Each one carried weight. Each one demanded repentance, and even though most people quietly ignored half the rules, the guilt remained. Looking back, the pressure to meet such standards feels heavy. Modern life has its burdens, but few couples today ask their priest for permission based on energy levels. The medieval approach was not just cautious, it was exhausting. And perhaps the strangest part is that while couples were forbidden from touching while tired, they were expected to produce heirs, maintain their homes, and attend church with the same breath. There was no room for rest, but there was always room for guilt. So the bedroom became another place where judgment lived, not from the spouse, but from the church, from God, from rules that no one fully understood, but everyone feared. It was not enough to be faithful. One also had to be perfectly healthy, perfectly alert, perfectly ready. Otherwise, what should have been closeness turned into confession. And for those who failed, who gave in while weary or weak, the worst punishment was not always public. It was private, a quiet doubt, a fear that they had done something wrong without meaning to, and that fear followed them into the next prayer, the next sermon, the next sleepless night. In the next chapter, we enter an even stranger territory where people turn to frogs and bones not for healing, but for birth control. In a world where the church controlled not just marriages but the meaning of family, some people found ways to bend the rules without breaking them outright. These were not grand schemes or dangerous rebellions. They were quiet, complicated workarounds, arrangements that existed in the gray space between sin and salvation. And among the strangest of them all was something now referred to as spiritual fraud. At its center was a type of marriage that could be real or fake, physical or ceremonial, and in some cases not even involving two living people. In certain regions, especially in rural France and parts of Central Europe, there were rare cases where a man and a woman would hold a wedding ceremony, even if one of them was already dead. The practice later called a posthumous marriage was used when a woman had conceived a child, with a man who died before they could marry. Instead of being shamed or having the child labeled as illegitimate, the woman would arrange a symbolic ceremony, sometimes in private, sometimes in front of the community. The name of the dead man would be spoken aloud. A ring might be placed on his grave, a candle lit, and the union, though not recognized by all, would offer the child a kind of legitimacy. It was not love, it was not even a partnership, it was paperwork made of ritual. These ghost marriages were not common, but they were not fictional either. Records show priests occasionally attended such events, not with joy, but with resignation. The church disapproved strongly, but local customs often went out. The people believed that the dead man's soul would be honored, that the woman would be protected from gossip, that the child would grow up with fewer questions. It was bureaucracy dressed in grief. Other types of spiritual trickery were even more subtle. In some places, especially where social control was tight, couples who had been physically intimate without marrying would quickly stage a full ceremony, not a full wedding, but just enough to claim that the act had happened within the bounds of marriage. A few witnesses might be invited, a local figure might recite a blessing, the couple would exchange tokens. Then, once the act was complete and the reputation protected, the entire arrangement could be quietly dissolved. No papers, no formal record, just whispers and silence. The goal was not to deceive the church directly. It was to avoid the social and spiritual consequences of premarital sex. In theory, anyone caught in such a lie could face harsh penalties, but in practice, communities often turned a blind eye, especially if a pregnancy was involved, especially if the families were willing to pretend the marriage had been real. Everyone wanted to avoid scandal, and sometimes pretending was easier than confessing. But not everyone approved. Church leaders saw these shadow weddings as dangerous. They undermined the sanctity of real marriage. They allowed people to slip between rules and live as if they were married without the responsibilities that came with it. Sermons were written condemning the practice. bishops issued warnings, and in some regions, local authorities created new laws to stop these rituals from happening at all. But like most things in medieval life, rules did not always stop behavior, they just changed how quietly it was done. There were also deeper fears at play. The idea of marriage with the dead raised questions about the soul, about consent and spiritual corruption. Some believed that by marrying a dead person, one could disturb their rest or even invite a haunting. Others feared that performing fake weddings would bring curses, not blessings. Stories spread of women who married corpses and then suffered years of misfortune, of men who lied about their vows and then died in battle. These tales served as warnings, though no one knew if they were true. But in villages with no doctors, no lawyers, and little hope of forgiveness, a good story was sometimes the only law. Behind all of this was a shared anxiety. People feared being left outside the church, outside marriage, outside family. They wanted their children to be safe, their relationships to be honored, and in a world where reputation was everything, even the dead could be part of a living problem. The truth is, many people simply did what they could. They were poor, they were constrained, they did not always have the money or the permission to marry in church, but they had each other and they had rituals, so they used what was available: a blessing spoken under a tree, a ring made of straw, a candle lit by a river. The ceremonies were not official, but they were heartfelt, and in the eyes of the couple, sometimes that was enough. Not all of these arrangements ended well. There were betrayals, abandonments, children born into shame, but there were also small victories, quiet households where two people lived as husband and wife, even without the bishop's approval, babies who were raised with care, even if the paperwork said otherwise. The church may have called it fraud, but the people called it survival. And perhaps that is what these stories reveal most clearly, that medieval life was not a simple tale of right and wrong. It was full of corners, edges, shadows. People navigated a maze of rules with more cleverness than rebellion. They adapted, they invented, they found ways to fit their lives into structures that were not made for them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it broke, but always it spoke to the quiet resistance of daily life. So when you hear of these ghost marriages or these fake ceremonies, do not imagine something magical or romantic. Imagine instead two people standing by candlelight, holding hands, saying words they hoped would protect them. Around them a few silent witnesses, a grave, a curtain. A child is on the way. It was not legal, it was not accepted, but in that moment it was real to them. Up next, we step further into the hidden world of belief, where amulets and animal parts were worn to keep unwanted pregnancies away. For many, the medieval monastery was a place of silence, a space removed from the temptations of the world. Heavy walls surrounded its courtyards. Tall windows let in filtered light, but revealed little of the life within. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where the body gave way to the spirit and where every earthly desire was set aside. But behind those quiet stone corridors, and beneath those habits of wool, things were often more complicated than they appeared. Monks and nuns were supposed to live apart from the world and from each other. Men stayed in their cloisters, women gathered in separate convents. Their days were structured around prayer, study, and manual labor. Meals were eaten in silence. Sleep came early, and every moment of the day was accounted for by bells and ritual. But even within such rigid schedules, human nature found room to breathe, and not always in ways that aligned with church doctrine. Despite the strict rules, there are records from across Europe showing that monasteries and convents were not immune to scandal. Some involved financial misdeeds, others were concerned with property or disputes over land, but some touched on matters the church feared most: intimacy, desire, secrecy. It turns out that celibacy was easier to demand than to enforce. In a number of cases, both male and female monastics were found to be engaging in secret relationships. Some of these were with locals who lived outside the walls. Others took place within the monastery itself, between those who had sworn the same vows. In certain female convents, abbesses had to investigate rumors of nighttime meetings between nuns. In male monasteries, older monks sometimes formed bonds with novices that went beyond instruction. These were not always violent or coercive, but they were always forbidden, and when discovered, they caused deep waves of embarrassment. In some documents, church authorities described their visits to inspect monasteries and check on the behavior of their members. These inspections could be sudden and invasive. They searched the grounds, questioned the residents, and looked for signs of misconduct. Occasionally, they found more than expected: hidden letters, concealed passages, pregnancies. The term mysterious births began appearing in certain reports. Babies left at doors. Infants were secretly passed off to local families. Nuns who quietly disappeared for a few months and then returned changed. These were not common occurrences, but they were real, and they challenged the image of the monastery as a place above temptation. Some reports read like a medieval version of a tabloid, only written in Latin. The church responded with alarm. Punishments ranged from expulsion to confinement. Some were sent to other houses for penance. Others were made examples of, paraded in shame before the public. Yet in some cases, the community simply tried to move on. A quiet transfer, a changed name, a reshuffling of leadership. The desire to protect the image of the religious order was sometimes stronger than the desire to expose every failure. What is more revealing, though, is how these events reflected the tension between the rules of religion and the realities of being human. Monks and nuns were not born without desire. They were people who had chosen, or had been placed into, a system that asked them to surrender one of the most basic parts of themselves. That choice was not always voluntary. Many were sent to monasteries as children. Some took vows before fully understanding what those vows meant. Others arrived because their families could not afford marriage dowries. The result was a community filled with people who had given up much, but who still lived in bodies that remembered what it meant to long. Life inside these walls could be lonely. The silence was thick. The days were repetitive. Contact with the outside world was limited. In such a setting, even small connections could grow intense. A shared glance during vespers, a brief moment of laughter during kitchen duty, the presence of someone who listened. These were not things easily ignored, and over time, they could become something more. In some places, the architectural layout itself worked against the rules. Monasteries often had many small rooms, long corridors, and areas poorly lit at night. Once the final bell rang and the doors were shut, it was not hard for someone to slip through a doorway or down a passage unnoticed. The thick walls muffled sound, candles flickered quietly, and the moonlight did not report back to the bishop. Not all monastic houses were the same. Some were strict and tightly managed. Others were more relaxed. The wealthier the institution, the more opportunities there were for comfort, secrecy, and indulgence. In a few cases, monasteries were accused of hosting feasts, harboring pets, and living more like landed gentry than spiritual servants. Scandals followed, as they always did, but so did attempts to reform. New orders emerged with stricter codes, harsher disciplines. Walls were built higher, rules printed longer, but still the problems continued, quietly, repeatedly. What makes this part of history especially poignant is how little it was discussed openly. The scandals were written down, investigated, and filed, but they were not shouted from the pulpit. To speak too loudly of monastic failure was to risk weakening the entire structure of spiritual authority. So most of it stayed hidden in ledgers, in letters, in whispers, and yet the truth lingered. Monasteries were places of faith, but also of contradiction. Sacred spaces built by people who, like anyone else, could feel cold at night, could get lonely, could make mistakes. The vow of chastity was a noble ideal, but it was not always a lived reality. In the next part, we turn from hidden walls to public shame, where the church used preaching not just to teach, but to name and describe forbidden acts in remarkable detail. In the medieval imagination, control over desire was a sign of virtue. Resisting temptation meant strength, and those who had no temptations at all, well, they were seen as the safest kind of servant. That was one reason why castrated men, often called eunuchs in other parts of the world, were sometimes given quiet places of trust inside noble households across Europe. In a world where women's honor was watched as tightly as gold, a man without desire was treated as a kind of human solution. These men were considered safe to place near noble women. They could carry messages, assist with dressing, tend to illnesses, and even sing in choirs without making anyone nervous. Some families preferred them as personal attendants. Others had them work as doctors or healers since they could be in the same room as a lady of status without scandal. In some cases, they were allowed to live in close quarters with noble women, which was unthinkable for most other men. The thinking was simple. If you remove the source of temptation, you remove the threat. But the truth was far less comfortable. Many of these men lived lonely lives. Some had been castrated at a young age, long before they understood what was being taken from them. Others had it forced on them later, sometimes as punishment, sometimes for a promise of work or favor. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. A body changed forever, a future reshaped, and often a quiet kind of exile. Their presence made others feel at ease, but that did not mean they were treated with warmth. It was often the opposite. People were suspicious of them. They were not considered real men, but they were not treated like women either. They lived in the in-between, trusted yet never quite accepted. They were often the last to marry, if they were allowed to at all, and the first to be blamed if something seemed strange. Their appearance might have been softer, their voices sometimes higher, but that only made them more vulnerable to gossip. In certain courts, a castrated man could rise to a position of influence. Some were favored singers, others were prized for their discretion. If a noble woman had secrets to protect or illnesses to treat, she might rely on such a man more than anyone else. But even then, trust did not always come with respect. It was a little like asking someone to guard the silver and then making them meet in the servants' hall. Their work was often invisible. They were expected to know when to speak and when to stay silent, to appear when needed and disappear when not. They might be called to light candles, wash linens, or help a young lady lace her bodice. They might spend hours alone in silence, waiting in an antechamber, just in case they were needed. Their presence was like the soft shadow behind the curtain, always there, but rarely noticed. Some were trained in medicine. A few were sent to study herbs in the body so they could tend to women without scandal. Others became tutors, singing instructors, or even confession aids. The roles varied from region to region, but the common thread was clear. They were useful as long as they didn't make anyone uncomfortable. But it's worth remembering that usefulness is not the same as kindness. Their castration, no matter how politely explained, was a form of control. It turned them into tools. And while they were praised for their reliability, they were often left out of every meaningful part of life. They were not allowed to marry nor to hold land in some places. They had no sons or daughters to carry on a name, and in many cases no one to hold their hand when they grew old. Even their deaths were quiet. Few were buried with ceremony. Fewer still had headstones with kind words. Many were simply forgotten. Their names appeared in household records, sometimes scribbled next to chores or listed with livestock, a reminder that even in service their humanity was easy to overlook. Looking back now, it is tempting to imagine them as tragic figures. And in some ways, they were. But they were also resilient. They learned how to move through the narrow spaces of power, how to listen more than speak, how to make themselves small enough to survive in a world that never made room for them. They were like windows that opened just enough to let in light, but never enough to breathe freely. Today, most people wouldn't think of them at all. Their stories were rarely written down. Their lives were not the stuff of legend or war, but they were there, quietly folding linens, lighting lamps, whispering advice, and carrying secrets that were not their own. And if their names are lost, their presence shaped the spaces around them. A noble woman stepped into a gown with help. A song played in the hall with a high, pure note. A letter was delivered by hands that trembled slightly, but never dropped it. So the next time someone talks about who held power in the past, maybe remember those who held it quietly, those who lived beside it, not inside it, and those who were trusted, not because of who they were, but because of what had been taken from them. In the next part, we'll enter a darker territory, where pleasure and shame collided behind closed doors, where the church drew strict lines, even for things no one could see, where sin was personal, but punishment was public. By the late Middle Ages, almost every act related to physical desire had been sorted, labeled, and judged by the church. Among all the forbidden behaviors, one stood out as especially frustrating to control. It required no partner, no evidence, and no confession unless the person chose to give it. The church called it a solitary sin. Others called it self-abuse. But no matter what word was used, the message was clear. It was not allowed. Even if no one else ever found out. Medieval religious authorities believed that this act weakened both body and soul. They said it drained a man's strength, damaged his health, and placed his eternal fate at risk. For women, the subject was less openly discussed, but the fear was there too. Desires left unregulated were said to invite the devil in. Some thought it could lead to madness, others to physical deformities or permanent guilt. The rules were harsh, but the reality was more complicated. Monks and priests who spent their lives preaching abstinence often admitted in private letters or confessions that the battle against private temptation was the hardest of all. The church knew it could not watch everyone. It could not lock every bedroom. So in addition to threats and moral lectures, they quietly developed a second system, a set of tips and tricks, ways to manage the body without breaking the law of the soul. The most common advice was simple: avoid warmth. Warmth stirred the blood and loosened control. So people were told to sleep on hard mattresses, avoid thick blankets, and leave windows open at night, even in cooler weather. Anything soft was considered suspicious. It was a time when sleeping comfortably was treated like walking a narrow path toward eternal fire. Cold water was another favored cure. Some suggested that cold baths taken just before sleep could cool the passions of the day. Others said splashing cold water on the face and neck upon waking helped remove tempting dreams. A few monasteries even required morning washes in icy basins, regardless of season, believing the shock would prevent the mind from wandering later. Food was also blamed. People were warned to avoid spicy dishes, rich meats, or too much wine. These were thought to heat the body and stir unwanted thoughts. Instead, they were told to eat dry bread, boiled vegetables in small portions. Some monks even ate in silence with their heads down, believing that conversation during meals might invite temptation. Compared to today's advice, columns about love and health, medieval guidance sounded more like instructions for building a cold storage unit. There were books written entirely about how to fight desire. Some were for priests, others were meant for married couples. They repeated the same ideas: stay busy, stay cold, sleep flat on your back or your side, but never on your stomach. Never touch yourself unnecessarily. Never sleep too much, and never spend time alone without a clear purpose. Boredom, it was believed, was the doorway to sin. Some of these texts were strangely detailed. A few writers, in their efforts to warn, ended up giving very specific descriptions of what not to do. This backfired more than once. Readers sometimes became more curious than cautious. It was the medieval version of putting a warning label on a locked door and accidentally making everyone want to peek inside. Confession was the one place where this sin could be spoken about, but even then, people used vague language. They said they had impure thoughts, that they had failed in their vows. Confessors usually knew what was meant. Some gave heavy penances, others gave light punishment but harsh words. A few even gave advice similar to what was written in the books: sleep less, eat bland food, work more. Inside monasteries and nunneries, the struggle was worse. Surrounded by silence, forbidden from touch, many monks and nuns fought private battles they could never name. Some wrote letters begging for strength. Others carved warnings into the walls of their cells. A few were punished after being discovered, but most simply lived with a weight of guilt, trying to stay pure by following the rules as best they could. For young people, the advice was often stricter. Parents were told to keep children busy with chores. Boys were advised to avoid idleness at all costs. Girls were watched for signs of wandering thoughts. In some places, young men were not allowed to sleep in beds at all, only on benches or in shared halls. Privacy was considered a danger, not a right. Desire, when left alone, was thought to grow like mold in the dark. The church never managed to stop the act it condemned so harshly. It could shame it, warn against it, write long texts about it, and design rules around it, but it could not remove it. Instead, it learned to live with the knowledge that many people in private ignored the warnings. Some felt shame, others felt nothing at all, and most simply moved on, hoping their small sins would be forgiven with a few Hail Marys and a lighter breakfast the next day. Looking back now, the rules feel strange. The warnings feel extreme, but they tell us something about the fear people once had about the body. Not just what it could do, but what it meant for them. The body was a test, a doorway, a battlefield. Every urge was a sign, every action a risk. They wrapped the body in layers of linen, silence, and fear, hoping that would be enough to protect the soul inside. And now, After all that, you are here reading this in a world with soft pillows, clean sheets, and maybe a small nightlight by your bed. A world where desire is no longer whispered about in fear, where privacy is allowed, and where sleep thankfully does not come with a moral warning. So rest easy tonight. No cold baths, no wooden planks, just the gentle comfort of knowing you are far from the rules of the 13th century, far from sermons and confessions. Thank you for staying with the story all this way. Good night, sleep well. May your dreams be free and your bed just the right kind of warm.